leading journalist and a good friend. I do have to tell you about a couple of upcoming events. We will take the month of August off, give you all a break. In September, we start back on September 10 with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Looking forward to very much to seeing her. And then you may remember a couple of years ago, the great book Talk of the Town with Mark Leibovich. Mark has a new book coming out in September. He will be here on September 17. So 2 Mondays back-to-back in September. Enjoy the month of August down. So Cy Hersh, certainly one of America's leading journalists. He has won every prize, I think, that a journalist can win, including the Pulitzer Prize. He is, without doubt, one of the 2 top investigative journalists in this country, if you consider Bob Woodward as the other one. Although what I think is that Bob Woodward may win in quantity, but Cy Hersh wins in quality of investigative reporting. And it's so good to see you, and thank you for coming to me. Great to see you. Thank you. In fact, I want to start right there because, as you talk about in the book, by the way, a couple of months ago, I know many of you were here for a book party to celebrate publication of my memoir, From the Left. I hate to admit it, but this memoir is better than mine. It is really damn good. It's a great, great read with lots of great stories in it. And East City Books is here to give you a chance to buy one, and Mr. Hersh will be glad to sign them after the event. But as you point out in the book, back in 2001, the LA Times did a story about sort of a rivalry between you and Bob Woodward in investigative journalism. And they said, here is the secret to your success. Bob Woodward, they described as polished, smooth, and punctilious. You, they described as scruffy, scrappy, stubborn, and loud. Is that the secret to your success?
You know, actually, we are different. I mean, I'm sort of bottom up and he's top down, but we've been friends. He was, this is ancient history, but the New York Times failed utterly on Watergate because I joined the New York Times in '72, and what I discovered, it was very respectful of presidents. That was just a tradition, you know, that they saw the president, and Scotty Reston was always there with the Secretary of State Kissinger. And so the idea that a president could go off the wall as much as Nixon had on Watergate, Kissinger kept on telling the Times that there's nothing to it. And so they failed. And at the end of the year, '72, I have been doing Vietnam stuff. I was hired to do Vietnam stuff because the Times wasn't that acute on Vietnam. In Vietnam they were, but not in Washington. Just stuffy a little bit. And and so I was asked to start doing Watergate, and I thought that's crazy. I don't know anything about it, but you just do it. You start reading and you get into it. I didn't know anybody in the White House, but I ended up getting to Florida. It's a great story with Frank Sturgis, one of the 5 break-in guys, who told me a lot about what's going on. And I wrote a story about it. It was the first time anybody had said Nixon after the election. You remember, he won the election 71-29, actually more with the absentee ballots. He won big, even though the Watergate scandal was very dominant. And I wrote a story saying Nixon, the White House was still paying these guys hush money. And it was a big breakthrough. And the first guy to call me was Bob Woodward, who I did not know. And what he said was interesting. He said, we couldn't do it without the Times, because the Times was such, the great force. And we were on the other side. We were hostile to the story. And so we stayed friends. And I will tell you, we are different. But he's an awfully honorable, good reporter. And I have lunch with him. We have our standing lunches, and we share stuff, and it's just a good relationship. Although I may scruffier, certainly a lot scruffier than he is. He's got a beautiful house in Georgetown.
In terms of investigative reporting, which is so important, early on, I think it was your first job in Chicago City News, and you talk about an editor there who gave you sort of the maybe the mantra or whatever for investigative reporting, which I loved. Quote, if your mother says she loves you, check it out.
City News.
That's still the rule that you...
You have to know about City News. It's gone now. But in Chicago, if you remember John Dillinger, organized crime, there was so much crime that in the 20s, there were 4, I think more newspapers then, but 4 major newspapers by the time I got on the scene in 59 or 60. It's hard to remember that far ago. And the 4 papers and the wire services and the radio stations put up money in the 20s to set up a little group of guys that would cover, it's called City News. We covered the courts and police, all the police stations, and we were just kids, hired out of Northwestern School of Journalism. And me, if you had a BA, I'd gone to law school and flunked out so horribly. I hated law school. I'd gone to law school. I was running on selling beer, but I heard about this place. All you had to have is a BA. And so I got hired as a copy boy, and within a couple of months, I'm on the street, downtown, covering Chicago police. And Chicago police were the most corrupt police system in the world. There were 2 rules of covering the police. One is you never wrote about a cop killing a black guy running away. That wasn't the word they used for him. And you never wrote, the cops used to arrest guys and say, you're okay, beat it, and then claim they were running away and shoot them. And the other thing is, you never interfered with the mafia. Sammy Giancana ran Chicago. So if you're a reporter covering, let's say the bar scene down near Chicago, and it's what's called Rush Street, a famous street of nightclubs that the mob controlled. And if somebody's found in the street with 14 bullet holes in it, and the police report it as a traffic accident, so I learned about tyranny right away. But you could just imagine, I'm a kid, I'm 23, 24, I'm covering the city. I'm out there with my press pass, and I'm learning about everything. And the mantra was, you don't make mistakes, because the Chicago newspapers follow up on what you said. If there's something important, you get to some fire, which a lot of people are dead, and you're covering it, you would start filing bulletins. The papers may send a bunch of reporters out to cover it. So you're the first chop of history. So it was an amazing experience. I got to like cops, despite the fact they were pretty crooked.
So I want to ask about 2, maybe certainly of your biggest stories, and they're sort of like bookends to your career. Not that your career is over, but one is My Lai and the other is Abu Ghraib.
Right.
Let's start with My Lai. I mean, how did you first find out about it, and how did you go about covering that story? What did it entail? And a little bit how you tracked down Lieutenant Calley.
The critical thing is that I grew up immigrant family. My parents barely spoke English, and I learned by myself. When I was 13, there was something called the Book of the Month Club, and they used to have a nonfiction selection every month, and I paid my 99 cents or $1 when I was about 13 or 14. Half the time, now, every 2 or 3 months, maybe, it would be something by somebody about the evils of communism, but there were history books. They were about the Habsburg monarchy. I remember Chinese history. I'm started reading this stuff. And so I'm a self-starter. And so it came from inside. And so I don't know why, I grew up skeptical of things, but I also knew you can't get anywhere without reading. I speak a lot to journalism groups, and I always start, there's 2 things I say, which is 1, read before you write. And the other one, of course, is get out of the way of the story. There's no such thing as a sensational story. There's just a story you tell that in the words, the sensation comes out. Don't hype, in other words, adjectives. So I eventually started out at City News. I went in the Army, got out of the Army, I worked for UPI in South Dakota, covering a legislature. This is way back in 61, 62. Different weather then. I got there in October, and my car got snowed in within a week, and I didn't get it out to April. You didn't bother. It was a small town, 10,000. You could walk anywhere. Anyway, and then I got a job at AP in Chicago. And by 62, 63, that war is starting in Vietnam. And I started reading about it. I not only I bought the New York Times every day, and I started reading. Bernard Fall was this great scholar on Vietnam, an American scholar. And there were a bunch of French guys, Latakier, that I took some French in school. I could barely read, but I started reading French articles that were being syndicated and pushed around. Looking for a chair?
Yeah, just up
right up here.
Yeah, there we go.
Right here.
Okay, good.
And so, in the church groups in '65, then I get sent to Washington by the Associated Press. I was I was a good reporter, and they assigned me to a great beat, the Pentagon, and I'm covering the war, and from the beginning, I'm finding those officers, and they're all over our society. In the intelligence community, in the State Department, in the White House, there's people that take that oath of office, and it's to the Constitution, and they mean it. It's not to their boss, it's not to the general, it's not to the president. So I found those guys, particularly I did some stories about McNamara wasn't telling the truth. We were losing more planes in North Vietnam and bombing than he was saying. So I got to know a bunch of guys running Navy aviation and in the Pentagon. We're talking about 2 and 3 and 4-star officers. And I wrote straight stuff. And so they began to talk to me about what's really going on. And I began to learn that there's a huge discrepancy between how we were doing in Vietnam, really, and how they were selling it, including the Secretary of Defense, Mr. McNamara, who wasn't telling us the truth. So from there, I began to read all sorts of stuff. As I say, church groups began to put collections of articles that were critical of the war and showed the violence of the war. It was a violent war. We were dealing with a guerrilla force that we couldn't see, and at night our guys were getting picked off by a sniper fire. They would fall on patrols in the ditches full of really bamboo sticks with poison, and a lot of them were dying that way. And so you'd have a company of 100 men. I'm talking about grunts. I'm not talking about the rear echelon. We used to call them REMFs, those boys who didn't fight. But the guys in the field, and they would lose in 2 or 3 months, maybe 10, 15 guys without getting into combat. And so they would begin to take it out on the people, inevitably. And so I'm learning this stuff. And so I got in trouble with the AP because I was increasingly critical of McNamara and his integrity. Of wire services, anyway. They reassigned me from the Pentagon to Health and Human Services, and I got the drift. So I went off and I did freelancing, and I spent a couple of years writing a lot. I was doing stuff 60, 68, 69, married with a kid and a mortgage and a dog and all that stuff and a car payment. So I'm looking for work. I was did a bunch of pieces for the New York Times Magazine, not the paper. They sort of ignored me, but the magazine, there was an editor there that liked me, and then Life magazine gave me an assignment. And then in 69, I get a tip one day from a young lawyer in town, who I later learned from somebody high up in the Pentagon, but we didn't talk about that for 40 years. And he said, there's been a terrible shootout in Vietnam, and some GIs shot 75 people, and they're scared to death in the Pentagon if the public would know about it. And so they're hiding it up, covering it up. And so I started working the story. I had a book contract then with Random House for a book about Pentagon waste, but it was boring. So I dropped it, and I just went after it. And you know what you do? In 69, the one thing Mel Laird was Secretary of Defense, who was a very decent guy, a congressman from Wisconsin. And you know that the Republicans and the Democrats who were conservative, who controlled the committees, Senator Russell and a lot of the conservative members of the House, Hebert and others, the Pentagon would never not tell them about something like this. And so I thought I would start, and in the Pentagon, writing about pilot loss and airplane retention. I did a lot of stuff with the Congress, and it's covering the Pentagon. You do a lot of stuff with the Congress. Much better Congress then than there is now. The members of the Congress, Mendel Rivers of South Carolina, very conservative, but boy, he had a great staff, and so they named carriers and everything after him. So, and before I decided to do that, I went to every archive. In the Army, I learned a lot about the Army. I wrote speeches and did stuff like that for a general. I was just a grunt. But I learned the Army, you can't hide anything in the Army. There's a lot of efficiency. I went to everything I could find. There was nothing about a shoot-up. Not in the legal office, not in the press office, nowhere. And everything's collected in the Pentagon. And so one day, and the thing about the military is black humor. You make fun of things. You're always bitching in the military. So anyway, so one day
Sounds like a newsroom.
Oh boy, nothing like a newsroom. Nothing more, no, nothing is, no.
Not that bad.
No, newsrooms make other newspapers come, anyway. If you're not at the New York Times, everybody's mad at you for being at the New York Times. You know what I mean? Anyway, I covered the Pentagon. I got a Pentagon press again because I was writing again about Pentagon waste. And I'm walking, and I see a colonel I used to deal with, an Army colonel, who's limping. And I see him in the corridors in the Pentagon. There's 700, I don't know, 17 miles of corridors. And I see him just going down, and he's going to get coffee somewhere. And I see him. I say, "Hey, man, what'd you do? What's going on?" And he said, "Oh, I saw he's frocked. He was going to be a general." He said, "I made general." And I immediately said, "You took a bullet just so you could make general, right? You know how it is. And so we're laughing about that. And I said, "So what's your job now?" He was doing stuff in something interesting earlier that he talked to me about. But he said, "I'm working for the commander-in-chief, the General Westmoreland, who's running the Army." I said, "No kidding. So what's this about some guy shooting up things? Some shooting up a lot of people in Vietnam." And he stopped, and I'll never forget, a straight arrow. He went like this to the bad knee. He'd been shot in combat. And he said, "Oh, come on, Cy." He said, "This guy, Callie," I got a name. I didn't know. "This guy, Callie, he didn't shoot anything higher than that." He said, "There's no story in there." And of course, you could argue that I could have said, "Wow, I didn't know anything about it. Thank you for the name," but you don't do that. I could tell this story negatively with the things you don't do. You're not, at that time, I didn't say to him, "By God, you've given me the first solid piece of information." I didn't say that. I said, "I hear you. I said, "Thank you." And I went off. I had a name. I found a clip 2 months earlier on a Saturday afternoon, about 5 in the afternoon, deadest day for the newspapers. The Sunday papers already made up. In the Monday papers, a clip of 3 graphs. A guy named Callie was a lieutenant. First lieutenant, not a enlisted man, and for an enlisted man, that's a big jump. Was guilty of unspecified number of killings in Vietnam. I had it. So that's it. That's how they were doing it. He was at Fort Benning, Georgia. And I called up the press office there on Monday, and some guy, a colonel there, some guy said, "Oh, he checked for me. Oh, he just shot up a gin mill, with prostitutes." And he wasn't lying. That's what they told him to say. And so, okay. And so I then found out he had a lawyer. I just felt that was the guy. There was nothing else like it, named Latimer. He would have been a retired colonel, a judge on the Court of Military Appeals, was a Mormon elder in Salt Lake. And I called him and said, "I want to talk to you about that case involving Callie." He said, "Oh, that's a big miscarriage of justice." And I arranged to see him. I made it look like it was casual, but, I said, "I'll be going to the West Coast." That wasn't true. I just went there. But I didn't want him. So anyway, I go to see him, and we all do strange things. I go to see him, and before I went, and this again I could tell this in a negative way, but I always like to know who they are. I read a bunch of his cases. I'd done two quarters at the University of Chicago Law School. I just gave up. I just didn't want to be a lawyer. I just walked away from it. But I knew how to brief a case, and I read those cases, and I went, and I began by saying to the judge, "Tell me why you made this decision, and what was the argument?" And anybody would be flattered if some guy comes in and is writing about a case that nobody paid much attention to, and it's not like Jeffrey Toobin here, who was here in the Supreme Court. he's in the middle. Anyway, the point is,
last guest.
Well, somebody mentioned it, I think. But anyway, no, I think I learned from somebody. He'd been there earlier. Somebody in the stairwell. Anyway, and so I then said, again, for some reason, I'd done enough reading about the war to know if you dropped a bomb in a village, which I thought happened, or a bunch of guys did artillery fire at the wrong village, I thought that's what happened. I really didn't know what was going on. I just knew they killed a lot of people. And I know that with a bomb in the wrong place, you can kill hundreds of people. And if an artillery battalion starts unloading those shells, they can throw 8 or 12 at a time. You can kill hundreds of people. I just doubled the number. I've been told 75, and I said, "So what, I heard he shot something like 150 people." He said, "Oh, no." And he went to a file cabinet, not a fancy office, and he had metal cabinets. He took out a file, and he showed me the first page of the charge sheet. I mean, innocently, really. I can't believe he did this. And it said Lieutenant William L. Callie Jr. was accused of killing, get this, 111 or 109 Oriental human beings. And I went, "Oh my God." My father worked in the black ghetto of Chicago, and I worked in my father's store forever. And he got cancer when he was 15, and from 16 to 22 till I got out of college, I ran that store for my mother. I took care of my mother and ran it. Every morning I opened it. So I understood the black community. Oriental human beings. Does that mean how many blacks make 12 blacks to make one Oriental? How many whites? And so I immediately got in touch with Mel Laird, who was a good guy. And I did get right.
Yeah.
And I said, I took it out, the word Oriental, because that would be people start killing Americans for saying Oriental, so racist. But anyway, from there, I had a charge sheet. I went off and I found Cali. I could take a week doing it. I'm actually a big movie company, just actually bought the rights to that. A guy named River Road, a guy named Bill Polat. He did some of the movies you might know, Brokeback Mountain.
Yeah.
12 Years as a Slave.
You mean just recently bought the rights to it?
Yeah, well, it's done, but I don't know when they're going to announce it.
Yeah.
But because of the My Lai story, it's sort of boy goes up against it. And here's the thing about America. I know you want me to go on. We have to go on, but the thing about America, I could go from Chicago, from a lower middle class household, immigrants, graduated from college in '68, not to Harvard Crimson or the Yale Daily News, and 11 years later, stick two fingers in the eye of a sitting president with the worst massacre. They killed 567 people, those boys. They went crazy for reasons that are complicated. And in a way, they were as much victims because they had no idea what the war was about anyway. But they killed 560, and I'm writing about it, prize, fortune, and money. And tell me about this country. I mean, come on. I mean, I'm not in some gulag. I'm getting awarded for writing the worst story you can imagine to write. It was scary as hell.
Just one of the stories. You can read all the rest of here in Reporter. But I want to go on to, if I can, to another person you talk about, a fascinating story. That you talk a lot in the book about a man you already mentioned, Henry Kissinger.
Oh, yeah.
Henry Kissinger you describe as the man lied the way most people breathed, and worse.
OJT, on-the-job training. Well, when you get to the New York Times, if you call Henry Kissinger, and if you're an investigative reporter at the Times writing about stuff, he calls back. He wouldn't call back other papers. And so the man, it just never told the truth. I'll give you a 2-minute story.
Okay.
Bill Sullivan was the head of the FBI, and there was a lot of worry about wiretapping a journalist in 1973. And when I knew Bill through somebody else, he was the head of the FBI. He's a very strong-willed guy. I think he felt, I don't know what happened, but one day he called me and invited me to lunch at a place frequented by the FBI people, an old place at 11th and F, and where the FBI brass used to go for lunch. And we have this lunch, and we're talking amiably. I have no idea what's going on. He's not saying what I'm doing. Watergate then. I'm in the middle of Watergate, writing a lot of stories with Woodward and Bernstein, but the New York Times is catching up, a lot of stories. And Bill gets up to leave. I didn't know him that well. He died in a hunting accident about 5, 6, 7 years later. But he's an interesting, serious FBI guy. And he got up and he said, I left something for you on my seat. Sort of like the movies in a movie. And I finished my coffee or whatever it was. And I got up casually and I walked over. And there were a couple of other FBI senior guys there, but nobody. I just picked up the envelope, walked outside, went back to my office and opened it. It was 17 wiretap authorizations, 16 of them signed by Kissinger, against newspaper reporters, his own aides in the White House, Mel Laird, and Bill Rogers, the Secretary of Defense, signing wiretaps on those guys. And so, because I had the original authorization, I say all this because Bill's long gone. I mentioned his name in the book. I also had the technicians who, those days you couldn't do like, now it's all internet. It's all just ding, ding, ding. We collect everything in the world. And what the NSA calls filters, algorithms. Otherwise we'd be overcome. But anyway, I called up a bunch of the technicians and I found, FBI technicians are just working class guys, good guys. And they all said, yeah, I was up there outside his house. Yeah, I did that. And I made sure that the documents were right. And so I start writing a story. I tell the paper that Kissinger signed 60 of them. He was denying, there were allegations about wiretapping. He not only was denying them. And so about in those days, it wasn't computer driven. You typed on paper and you filed 300-400 words at a time at a take. But a summary of the story was left for people to see in the Bureau and for New York to know. This is going to be a big story the next day, obviously, because Kissinger repeatedly denied it. And about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Scotty Reston, who's a very darling man, a real reporter, even though he was a very fancy columnist, comes up to me in slippers. He had an office in the back. And you could always go get a good shot of vodka there if you need it. Anyway, he said, I just want you to know, Cy, he said, Henry's just called me. He's going to resign if you write that story. And he said, I want you to think about it because he is holding the government together. And I said, Scotty, well, I can't do that.
But that was a classic trick of Kissinger's, right?
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Then he had Al Haig called me up. And because I'm Jewish, he said, Al Haig called me about 6:30. I sort of liked Al Haig because this is the job he had to do. And he just would do it. He said, I knew him. Al Haig was Kissinger's deputy of going to, I think he's then already a 3 or 4 star Army general. And he said, Cy, he said, I know you're Jewish. I said, yeah. And he said, so let me ask you something. You've probably lost a lot of your family in the Holocaust. I said, well, my father and mother both came from, yes, they had people they didn't know that were killed, many. And he said, well, Henry Kissinger lost 2 or 13 people of his family in the Holocaust, the World War II, the German thing. He said, if you really think after that he could wiretap his own aides, he said, I want you, I'm just telling you what he said. I want you, I wrote this story. He said, I want you to give us 1 day. I guess they figured maybe tomorrow some magic would come. I'd drop dead or something because the story was going to go. And I looked at it and I said, Al, this story is going to New York. I don't think we could do it. And that's why, what can you do with a guy like that? And then later when I wrote a book about him, he went on some TV show and they asked him about the book and he said, this is horrendous stuff. And he sold maybe 30,000 copies overnight by saying, I've never met this man. I talked to him forever. He would always talk. I'll say this much about him. It was hardworking for Haldeman and those guys and for Nixon. It was hard because they didn't trust you and they always were wondering who your friends were. And he liked to socialize and they hated the Georgetown crowd. And actually in the last 10 years, he's made a lot of sense in a lot of his things. So in a way, I still think he's capable. I can't think he's going to change his spots. But in a way, I would tone down what I say about him. He's grown up.
This was a time that I was surprised, maybe to be reminded or to learn reading the book, that the CIA was also involved in some pretty ugly stuff. And Kissinger was right in the middle of it, particularly with Chile. And you were asking about Chile and Allende. And the CIA was involved in assassination, right?
Everything, yes. They were involved in, but they were doing it. I ended up talking, Helms, of course, I wrote a bunch of stories about it. Dick Helms had been the head of the CIA at the worst of the times. And later, before he died, we sort of reconciled. He called me back, and it was always because of pressure from the presidents. Although, God knows, after World War II, the Russians were very aggressive, and there was what they called wet ops, and we were matching them. We were as tough as the Russians were in terms of eliminating people we thought were spies for them.
So if we're talking about Allende, did Nixon know what was going on? If we're talking about assassinating Cuba, did John F. Kennedy know what the CIA was doing?
Of course. John F. Kennedy was a hands-on president. Of course. There's a great memo in here that I'll read you about the Kennedys that it wasn't from Arthur Schlesinger to the president everybody knows the Bay of Pigs. That was the disastrous raid we had. And it was Kennedy got in office and Nixon had planned it already, just to show you how tough Kennedy was, another level of toughness. Kennedy was very friendly with the Georgetown crowd in the CIA. Dick Bissell was then the head of operations, and he lived in Georgetown. He lived close to where I live in Cleveland Park on Newark Street, and they were all very social. And Kennedy was part of the gang, and so Nixon knew that they were talking to him about the Bay of Pigs. In the last month of the campaign, Kennedy absolutely knew that they were planning to assassinate Castro in this raid. That was the whole purpose of the raid. But it wasn't going to take place until the next year. And he spent a month complaining about Nixon not doing anything about Cuba when he knew he was secretly doing something about it. And Nixon was going nuts with it, but he had to keep the secret. He loses the election. Kennedy has the raid. It's a disaster. But before the raid, this was a memo to the president written. The raid was, I think, the 19th, 9 days earlier. Arthur Schlesinger, and I have a bunch of pictures, photographs of this, about 36 of them. It was just fun to do, including some interesting stuff that I wanted to write. Anyway, Schlesinger writes, Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's power, although he was a magnet for women. He was so beautiful, but his real success was with men. They loved him. Sorensen loved him. Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, loved him. Kennedy loved him. They just adored him, and they swooned at his feet. He was magic because he had Marilyn Monroe, and he was also beautiful, and he was smart, and he was witty. Ben Bradley was another one who I adored. I like Ben Bradley. I got to know him very well. But Ben was much too close to him. Anyway, so Schlesinger writes this memo on April 10th. For the president, Cuba, political, diplomatic, and economic problems. Protection of the president. The character and repute of President Kennedy constitute one of our greatest national resources. Nothing should be done to jeopardize this invaluable asset. When lies must be told, they should be told by subordinate officials. At no point should the president be asked to lend himself to the cover operation. This is the lying about what we were doing in Cuba, why we were building up. It was a cover story for an attack. And that, there was a lot of leaks about it, but still it was sort of holding. It did hold. For this reason, there seems to be merit in Secretary Russ was the Secretary of State, then Dean Russ, suggestion that someone other than the president make the final decision and do so in his absence, someone whose head can later be placed on the block in case things go it's amazing to me. It was found, an academic found it 10 years later in some file. They didn't get rid of it. But that's what you do. It's called plausible denial. And so Kennedy, it's the real story. I'll tell you something. I was working for the New Yorker in 2001. I was doing big oil and stuff. When 9/11 happened, David Remnick, who's the very astute editor there, called me up at 9:30 in the morning. He said, well, I was going to spend years writing about big oil and money and stuff. He said, well, you're not doing that anymore. You're doing this story, and he was right. I did. But one of the things I did is I knew a lot about Iraq and nuclear weapons because I paid a lot of attention to the United Nations, had a team, a team called UNSCOM that was supposed to be checking for weapons. And it was a great thing. It was composed of the Russian special operators, French special operators, Aussie, British operators, that our SEALs and our green black belt guys, the best of all of them, were all working together inside Iraq, led by a team led by an American, a guy named Scott Ritter, a Marine. And I read all the reports, and I knew they weren't finding anything. So when the government kept on saying between from late 71 until the attack, which was in April 2001 to 2003, when we started bombing Baghdad, that high probability that he had weapons of mass destruction. I just knew from reading stuff. There's something called the IAE, International Atomic Energy. They put out quarterly reports. Everything had been bombed in 91 when we attacked it the first time. I kept on writing, there's no evidence. Despite what they say, there's no evidence. And of course, my editor always would say, but it could be that there is. And we later, when it was clear that there was no bombs, every time the government said, we have high confidence in something, I understood it meant we don't know. And so I will tell you this, and this is radical for a lot of people here. Every time the government says we have high confidence that Russia did indeed hack the Democratic National Committee, I'm saying if they knew, they'd tell us. So I am skeptical. I haven't written anything about it, but I've been skeptical about it and watching this stuff for years. And I think at some point, I don't like to get into the secrets that are still going but we have our National Security Agency, which does this international monitoring, we're really good. We always complain about the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians are very good, but the truth is we're great. And I can tell you right now, if we know. And the fact that they're not saying we know it's Russians, they're only saying we have high confidence and we believe it's credible, that worries me. It means they don't know.
I can see people itching to get their questions in. But I want to give you such great stories, but if you would just tell us again the story about Tom Wicker and LBJ.
No, it's
covering presidents.
You want me to do it the whole way?
Well, you can temper your language.
Let me tell you what's going on. I don't know if you remember Tom Wicker. Tom Wicker was he was the North Carolina reporter. North Carolina has this great tradition of wonderful journalists, and Tom was the best. Before I joined the New York Times, Tom was he covered the civil rights, and he was named a Washington bureau chief when he was about 33, and also a columnist. And he was a paragon. He was just when I joined the New York Times, the columnists were Tony Lewis and Russell Baker, who was still alive, living in Leesburg, so witty, and Wicker. They were more or less. We didn't get every day yelling and screaming about Trump, who I think is going to be reelected, unless the Democrats figure it out. It's going to be elected by 50 miles. Anyway, I don't need. So, you have to understand the Times is a crazy place. And the editor of the Times was a guy named Abe Rosenthal. He was a great editor, but I had done My Lai, and I was writing about it. And he wanted me to do something special for the Times, and I wouldn't do it. I said, I'm just writing. We had 35 newspapers buying my stories. I was a freelancer. I didn't go to the Times with it because they would eat me up. And so I was selling the story as a freelancer, and it just caught on. And we had a terrible argument. And so in 72, I'm working for the New Yorker. I got to William Shawn of the New Yorker. And they called me one day, and I had a visa to Hanoi, and all of a sudden I'm asked by an editor if I would see Abe. Abe wouldn't call me himself because I had yelled at him. We'd yelled at each other about something. I was afraid I'd say no. So, strange man. Brit Hume. Anybody remember Brit Hume? Brit Hume was worked for Jack Anderson. Was a great reporter. He was a great reporter. He later worked ended up being the anchor guy for Fox News.
Yeah, he's still commentator for Fox News.
Let me tell you something. I knew him as a reporter.
Tom Wicker.
Well, I just want to tell you, I once got the Times when I was working at the Times when Brit was then working for ABC, and he's complaining to me. He said, every time I have to go see somebody, I was in West Virginia yesterday. Before I see this guy, this miner who'd been driven out by a flood, I have to stop at a gas station and put on my makeup, he said. So anyway, so I said, come to the Times. So I tell Rosenthal, this guy's great. And so, sure enough, Brit Hume's a straight arrow. Rosenthal's not. He's this crazy wacko. And so, but bright. So they go and they have this meeting, and about 2 hours, an hour and a half later, Brit Hume comes out, and I said, what happened? He said, that guy's. He said, nothing's going to happen. I said, what happened? He said, well, we talked for a little while. Then he took me to this little tea room he has on the side of his office. He served in Japan. Rosenthal did, and he always loved Japanese stuff. And he said to me, you're great. You're really a good reporter. I think you'd be great here. But he said, I want you to know you have to want to love the paper. And I'll tell you what he said without using the word. He said, Mr. Rosenthal, I don't want to F the paper. I just want to work here. And that was the end, he said.
He didn't get a job.
Well, he said, I'm not working for this crazy guy. And then he went to Fox and had a great career. And I tell you, so anyway, so Wicker, I joined the paper in 72, and I'm writing about Vietnam. And then I get into Watergate. And in 73, 74, before the, I'm doing a lot of really good stuff for the, Bob and I agreed it was the halcyon day of being a reporter with Woodward. We ended up working together. We had so much stuff to do. We met, he told his editors, I didn't tell mine. We used to play tennis a couple of times a week, and we share stories off the books because there was just too much to do. Nixon was in such trouble. And so I had at that time, the tapes of Nixon's tapes were known, but they weren't published. And a U.S. attorney was prosecuting one of the couple of the cabinet, I think maybe even Mitchell was prosecuting him, and he got tapes. U.S. attorneys were able to get tapes from the Justice Department because they had control of them. They weren't made public yet. And one of the guys I knew a U.S. attorney, one of the federal guys, a good guy, a senior guy, called me one day and he said, I'm sending you something. He said, it's really got me enraged. It's so unbelievable. There was two Nixons. There was the public Nixon that was sort of pious, and we now know the other Nixon. And there was one tape from early 73 when Nixon just went off on minorities. John Sirica was the judge leading the Watergate Committee. He was that dirty wop, and then he went after blacks with negative words, Jews, he just was one he must have had a couple martinis too many. It was with Haldeman and Kissinger. It was pretty horrible. And it was about a 3-page transcript, and he mailed it to me. And so I did call him back, and I said, you know, this is going to cause hell. And he said, I'll be all right. And so the Times was skittish about it. There was a lot of back and forth, and we told the White House in great detail about it. And Nixon came after me in the story like great guns. There is some transcripts where he was always worried about me because I was writing about foreign policy too, and the war. And there was some stuff there that's really interesting that I didn't know about that came out about 5 years ago. I was a little thorn. And so he went nuts about this story that I was writing. And after a lot of debate, the Times decided to run it. And it was all over page one, Nixon using these words, and it shocked a lot of people, caused a lot of outcry. So Wicker comes up to me, and he's then the columnist. And he said, he slid up next to me, and I just knew him I knew him, but not to go to lunch. I was the kid. And he'd been at the paper forever. And he said, let me tell you a story. He said, in 66 or so, I was the bureau chief, and I was also covering the White House. And Nixon was expanding the war. In 66, Johnson, 66. Johnson had expanded the war. You don't remember, but in 65, Johnson spent 5 months lying about the facts. There were troops there. He didn't tell us. You know, people talk about Trump's lies. I'm not a fan of Trump, but Trump's lies are like, you interview him and you say at the end of the interview, well, just to repeat, you said so-and-so. No, I didn't say that. You know, that's the kind of stuff. He doesn't remember what he says. But lying for 4 or 5 months to the American people about combat operations that you're not telling us about, that's really, anyway, I always had a different feeling for Johnson. I didn't like him about the war. And so what he did, he came up to me and he said, so on a Friday, he was covering the White House, and that meant on Friday, Johnson went, this was summer, I guess, and went down to the ranch. I've been to the ranch. If you've ever been to the ranch, it's a huge estate in East Texas, just a great ranch he had. A lot of dirt roads. And he used to ride around in a 4-door Lincoln convertible. He loved to do that. And so you go down for the weekend with the press corps. And Tom, before leaving on Friday with the press man, wrote a piece for the Saturday paper. It was an analysis. They used to call it then a Q header. It was a piece in which he could analyze. He could get out of stop being a reporter. I mean, we all do it now all the time in the press. This notion of limits is gone. You know, you can say anything you want about Trump or anything you want about anybody. Anyway, there's no limits anymore. He wrote a piece critical of the war, and those days the Times had a lot of money. We'd fly down the Friday paper to the ranch on Saturday morning, so all the reporters, 30 or 40 who came with the president and the White House staff, could read it. We were the great New York Times, August, a lot of money to spend. And there on the front page is his piece, raising questions about the war. So at 10 o'clock or 10:30, George Reedy, I think, was the press secretary then, a really nice guy from Milwaukee. And the press would gather, and he would announce what they call a lid is on. That meant, guys, go play. We're not going to, no statements. He's going to have a quiet day and go play golf or tennis or get drunk or whatever you want to do. And while they're there, and Tom was there, here comes this cloud of dust, and the Lincoln comes up. And he's alone. Johnson comes up, and he slams on the brake next to the press corps, leans over, opens the door, and yells, Wicker. Goes like this. And Wicker gets up and gets in the car, and they take off. And they go down about a mile or two down the road, dust all over, and they get to some bushes. I've been to the ranch. There's a bunch of trees, and Johnson wheels off into the grass, puts the car in gear, leaves the motor off running, says nothing, jumps out and walks behind a bush and defecates. And this is Wicker telling me the story. And wipes himself with leaves, gets back in the car, turns it around, goes like a bat out of hell back to the crowd. When he gets back, he's facing the other way, leans over, opened the door, not says a word, but click Wicker no, and gets out. So Tom then says, let me tell you what happened when I wrote this story, critical of the war, the first time the Times really went at him on the war. He said, he told me what happened. And he said, so here's the thing, Cy, he said, I knew then he was going to continue the war. I didn't know it in a professional way. I understood he was never going to back off. Because if he reacted this way to a crappy story, he said, I'm paid, in the New York Times, I knew then that was going to be a disaster. And he said, I wrestled with what to do. But ethically, I didn't have the courage, or I didn't, he put it that way, but I also said you would never have gotten that story in the paper. But he said, there was a way to tell that story to suggest he's really unbalanced about it, and I didn't do it. And I know you had a lot of heat for this story. I just want you to know I'm glad you did it, because I think it shows how unbalanced this man too is. We ought to know about it. It's a great story.
Yeah.
And by the time I decided to write this book, he was dead, but his second wife was a correspondent for one of the networks living in Maine. And I did talk to her about it, and she said she didn't remember that, but she remembered similar stories about Johnson. She said that's very, very, so that's the best I could do.
So Donald Trump may not be our grossest president ever, as we thought. At any rate, Cy Hersh is here. He is yours.
Yeah,
You've got stories to tell.
All right.
And the microphones, we have one here. And
if it's okay, we'll stay a little later, because I didn't give enough time for questions. Yes, ma'am.
Please, yes. I guess we start back here. Yeah. I'll let you with the microphones just...
Go ahead, shoot.
Yeah.
Question about My Lai. I've always wondered why it took so long for that story to come out. I don't remember exactly.
Does everybody hear him? No, the mic's not on.
It was on, but not quite loud enough. Try it again, John.
You got it. Go again.
All right. I've always wondered why it took so long for the My Lai story to come out. You uncovered that story in Washington.
18 months later.
18 months, okay. But Vietnam was flooded with reporters at that time, and there were quite a number of people involved directly in that incident, and others up the line who found out about it. It just seems so odd that people wouldn't have bragged or expressed remorse or whatever to their friends in the military. What are your thoughts about that?
You asked me a question that's impossible. The Pentagon didn't want it to come out, and what they wanted Calley to do, this I learned from his lawyer eventually, they wanted him to plead guilty to manslaughter. Take a couple of years and bury him. But you have to understand, when I saw the judge, I still thought it was a bomb that went away. And when I began doing the story, I realized these kids had been in the country for 3 years, 3 months. They were a company of 100. McNamara was troubled by the criticism of the war from the draft. When I was in the Army, I was facing the draft, and my bunkmate was a guy just gotten his master's degree from the University of Wisconsin in art history, that kind of stuff. There was a golf pro later. He didn't make it on the circuit, but he ended up teaching golf at he used to give me lessons, in the Army. So you had a different class of people, and McNamara, the war was getting ugly by 65, 66, and very violent. I was learning that in the Pentagon. Not much you could do about it without jeopardizing some officer's career. I knew it was ugly. I knew that the criticisms from church groups were valid, and McNamara knew it too, and he lowered the standards. He called it Project 100,000. He took in 100,000 kids, mostly the larger percentage of Hispanics, larger percentage of African Americans, and mostly rural kids. He wanted to, I later worked for somebody running for the war, Eugene McCarthy, who was a very moral. He was a very brilliantly, quietly religious. He had spent 9 months in silence in a Benedictine monastery, but he always that with nothing to do with religion. He was totally, as other people aren't. He never talked about religion. I was writing speeches, and his press secretary, he ran against Johnson in '60. I was so frustrated by the war, I did that. And John McCarthy complained about this lowering of the standards, said he was changing the color of the corpses. He wanted upper middle class, white and upper middle class, educated Afro-Americans and Hispanics. It was an education issue. Not someone. He wanted to change the color of the corpses. That's what he used to say. And so these kids were told after 12 weeks of just losing 20 people through punji sticks and snipers and drowning, trying to cross the river with, the 80-pound pack they had, and drowning. And they were wild, ready for payback. And they were told by a CIA officer at a briefing, that's how dumb things were, that they were going to meet a North Vietnamese battalion the next day, or company. Nobody'd seen a North Vietnamese. This was in Central Highlands. It was an area very much anti-government. And what we call the Viet Cong was a group known as the National Liberation Front. They didn't want to be communists. They really were nationalists. They didn't want that government, the two government, to run. And in fact, after the North took over the South, they killed a lot of the NLF people because they were never going to be communists, and they hated the communists. It's sort of interesting. The North Vietnamese are really brutal. They killed people that fought with them in the war against the Americans and the South Vietnamese army just because of politics. Anyway, and so these kids were ready to go, and you have to give them credit. They got up at 3. They did what the GIs did. They smoked their dope, and the officers drank their booze. They all got high, and they got on the choppers, and they were going to go kill and take on the 48th North, a real combat battalion that would have blown them away. So these 80 or 90 guys, they had some replacements, land outside the village, and they go in and they find 550, 560 men, women, old men, women, and children making rice for the morning, about 6:30, 7 o'clock. As I learned this OJT too, as I'm doing the story, I just didn't know how bad it was. They round up people and begin to execute them. It's one of the great massacres of our time. They raped and they killed. And I had a 2-year-old son. I went nuts with this. They would take babies and throw them up, live babies, and catch them on bayonets. It was just the worst thing you'd ever seen. It was everything I thought the Germans had done, you know. I mean, I thought that's the way we and the Japanese and Germans. I didn't know we fought like that. I mean, all war is hell, of course. We know that. But we had World War II was censored. We didn't know the whole war until some guy about 25 years later showed some pictures of dead Marines. You know, I mean, it was an awful war. Okinawa, we lost thousands of guys. We didn't talk about it. Anyway, it was just ghastly. And so it wasn't, what happened is the Army couldn't have this story out. They wanted Kelly to plead, and they buried it. It was buried. And the friend who told me learned from somebody only in the last 3 years that I learned where he got the story. And that's why it was garbled. You know, remember Trade Last as a kid, you tell the story and it went along. And by the time you got to the end of whatever the circle was, it changed. It was an officer. It was always Cali. And there was one guy they wanted to prosecute Cali. The other groups, there were 5 other lieutenants there. And there were captains, and there was a colonel flying above, and there was a 1-star general flying above him, and the commandant of the American Division was flying above that. And everybody saw the commandant, by the time I got to it, is, get this, he's commandant of West Point. His name is General Coster. And he's going to be censored for dereliction of duty after I write these stories. The Army did a great job investigating it afterwards, but it took publicity to do it. Yeah. And the kids wouldn't talk about it because it was just too horrible to talk about.
Let me jump in and get a question on this side.
I'm sorry, it's an inadequate answer, but it just was covered up as bad things will.
Thank you. Mr. Hersh, I've really enjoyed your talk, and I remember you from the 70s. I grew up in India, and I admired you for revealing that Morarji Desai got $20,000 from the CIA, and more than that, the fact that he drank his own urine. So I remember that very well, but I can't think of anyone more knowledgeable than to ask you this question. I have a colleague who enrages me.
Can everybody hear him?
Yeah.
Okay.
Enrages me, with all the pro-Trump sort of issues. But when I asked him what he thought about the separation of Mexican children South American children at the border, he said, do you have a valid resource on the data and what really is happening beyond information that you get from New York Times and Washington Post? What's your answer to that?
Look, I'm like you. I'm reading the papers. We went to a dinner with some neighbors, and there was a woman from, I can't say where, who was doing some stuff in the government, concerned about it and going down there. And I know some things about Trump because that's just what I do for a living. I have friends that still not only in the national security business. I don't know political side, and Trump he's much misjudged. As I say, this is the part of the policies I can't like him for, because there's something horrible about separating women from children, because the government would say the woman running the program from that blonde woman, Nielsen, she will say, well, this is nothing unusual. We're arresting these people. They crossed illegally. And when we arrest a woman, we separate them from their children. We put them in jail. But of course, that's a short way of looking at it, because there's something very special about people coming. They're making illegal acts, but in many cases, and enough so that you have to consider that they're running in Honduras and other places. They're running from tyranny too. So you have to at least give them a hearing before you declare them illegal. And so, but what I know about Trump is he's not a reader, but there were 15 Republicans running against him. I counted it up. With almost 300 years of political experience, he took them all down. He took down 2 dynasties, the Bush dynasties and the Clinton dynasty, and misjudged them at your will. He is capable of saying very interesting things when people pitch programs, ideas, and operations. And I don't think he's interested in more war. He's interested in bringing boys home from Europe because he wants to make America rich, and he thinks that's one way to do it. And you know, I'll tell you, it plays very well, not necessarily in Washington or New York or in California, but it plays in Middle America. And yes, and so all I can say is that I've been doing stuff for this book. It came out in June. I was somewhere in New York in a morning thing, and they asked me the same question. And this was the morning it was all over the news. It had been going on for 2 months, and only when a group called Political, I think, some group, ProPublica, broadcast a tape of a kid crying.
Yeah.
That would make the headlines. I don't know where everybody was for 2 months. This has been going on for months. But I did say, I remember saying, my instinct about him is he didn't know a thing about it, and he's going to move to stop it. And he started to roll back, and he'll probably do more because he's interested in being reelected. So, you know, what can I tell you except that the idea of taking children, if you're worried about making monsters, that's the way to make monsters and terrorists, separating children from their parents. It's beyond belief traumatic. Any brain knows you don't do that. Yes, they're technically guilty of walking across the border and not going through a border point and asking for asylum. But that's been made almost impossible by us, and people are going to come. And the border problem's an issue, but that's not the way to attack it, obviously. Yes. Okay.
Next question on this side. How about you? I'll let you with the microphones choose because you're closer to the people there.
Sorry, let me move to where you can actually see me without turning your body.
No, I don't. I'm capable of turning my body.
So I wanted to ask you, your career, you've doggedly kind of grabbed onto stories and never let go, and I think that's why you've had such amazing success. I want to ask you about a story where you did let go, and that's Project Azorian, the Glomar Explorer story, where you found it before anybody else did, and then
let it go until the LA Times broke it. Why are you asking me that question?
Tell us all again about the story.
Oh, Azar was go ahead. Tell you know.
Just
about it. If you know it,
not the whole story, but the name you.
So the CIA worked with Howard Hughes to create a ship to steal a Soviet submarine that
not steal it, to pick it up,
to grab it from 18,000 feet under the Pacific Ocean, under the nose of the Soviets, and try to cover it up.
The reason they did it, their explanation was that we're going to get the code book, which they've had so many times. But also it was carrying some nuclear-tipped missiles.
Right, 3 nuclear missiles. And of course, that we can neither confirm nor deny.
We wanted to be able to exhume those and learn what you can. So that it had crashed, it had gone down in 68 or 69 in the South Pacific, and it was a big secret. And somehow I picked up a code word about it in 72 that there was, and here's what the reason people talked to me about it. It was, we were going to go get a Russian submarine that had blown apart for just the hull, nobody shot it or broke it up. It just inadvertently broke up. We had one called the Thresher that broke up off the coast of the East Coast years later. Terrible loss of life. And it's a trauma. And so we knew, we pick up a lot of signals. We knew pretty much where it was, and we had an idea. And but it was budgeted $750 million. And Ford had come in to replace Nixon, and one of the things he had to do was cut $250 million from the milk budget for school kids that couldn't eat, couldn't afford breakfast. And so there were people in the government, there are people like that thought, this is nuts. So somebody told me something about it, and I went to, I like a lot of people in the CIA, the ones that are really, in the olden days, they really were motivated. They were anti-communist, but they also were motivated by a better America. They also were they also wanted, there was something called there was idea of you could have one world. There was a lot of people they wanted the UN, and they wanted they were almost idealists. I mean, the Russians got tough and we got tough, so that ended quickly. But anyway, I'm at a dinner with a guy named Tom McCoy, who was a station chief in Laos, a good guy. and a friend of Gene McCarthy's, and I met him through McCarthy when McCarthy was running for the presidency. And I said, I'd heard the word Jennifer, which was an early code word, later was Azorian. And I mentioned the word Jennifer, and it was the most funniest reaction. There were a couple other guys there from the community, I guess. I'm like, right? Because they're so nutsy about their code words. And if you have it, they just think, oh my God, you've got everything. Well, I just knew a little bit about it, some project to get a sub somewhere. And I wasn't interested. Watergate was on, and I was under pressure from the Times. I was brought in, I'm the star, and the editor of the Times says to me at the end of 72, after I've been at the Times for 6 months, writing only about Vietnam and having a ball, writing about a general who bombed without orders secretly because Kissinger ordered him to. I'm having so much fun writing this stuff because the war was going bad. It was easy to do it. And all of a sudden I'm doing Watergate, and I didn't know anybody in the White House, and Woodward Bernstein was so far ahead. I mean, it was a real tough thing. And so anyway, I'm doing Watergate then. This is early 73, and I didn't pay Jennifer Schmenifer, I didn't care. And Bill Colby, the new head of the CIA, calls me up. This must have been a little later. I think Schlesinger was there, maybe mid 73, when I'm chasing Watergate like crazy. And he said, I have to come talk to you. And I said, wow, I usually go see the CIA guy, but if you want to come to my office, he said something very important. I'd like to speak to you privately. So I invited, I'm a bureaucrat. I invited the deputy bureau chief. The bureau chief was on travel. A guy named Bob Phelps, a wonderful guy. He'd been the deputy bureau chief in Washington, a very good editor. I said, you join us. And he comes in and he says, a very important project that's very important to us. And he said, without getting into specifics, and he said, I really want your permission. He said, we only have a very small time span. And we've just lost one window. It must have been in the fall. In the summer, we're going to go again next summer. There's only a 6-week window. It's very deep, as you know. I didn't know anything. And he said, there's only a certain time where the currents, we're 12,000 feet down. Anything we try to do, any rescue device would break because of water pressure, unless there's a certain time when the waves aren't so acute, or whatever it is. And I said, I'll tell you what I said. I said, I'll drop that in a minute, but I need something in exchange from you on Watergate. And he gave me something. And that's the story. And so then I went and chased the story. He gave me a lead in something beautiful. He didn't betray his secret. He told me where there was something that everybody had missed. And he said, I'm just telling you something that's there that people missed. I'm not going to like what you do, but I'm glad you're cooperating. Little did I know that he then went around to everybody else in the media and said, even Hersh is cooperating on this. And Abe wrote with all the New York Times. So a year later, there's a story in the LA Times about a ship rescuing a ship at 12,000 feet below and Watergate's over by then. This is 74. And I go nuts. I said, oh my God, it's that story. And so this is another one of these time things where I then go crazy on the story, and I go way beyond what the LA Times had written. They had some stuff wrong, and I discovered that not only did we get a couple of torpedoes, we also got 12 Russian submarines, sailors, which in the sea, this is sacrosanct. You don't rescue other. So we didn't know what to do, and it turns out they did a video. They did a burial at sea. They gave with honors. I guess they got Russian flags and dropped them into the sea, as you do. The Navy's very good on this stuff, really very good on appropriate burial. And any Navy captain will tell you it's very important about morale. Yeah. And then they gave a video of it that I was able to get hold of. It's so silly. And so I'm doing this whole story. And meanwhile, I spent a month and I write what became this big headline in the paper, a 7,000-word whole page about it. I went down and found some of the crew guys in Memphis and Tennessee. I got drunk with them for 2 days. Best fun I ever had as a reporter, buying them all beer and whatever. And seamen are wild, man. Professional merchant mariners, when they're off that boat, they are just out of it. They're gone. They play. Anyway, I had no idea. And I'm sedate compared to those guys. Anyway, and so there was a big flap because Colby, meanwhile, goes to the publisher. He knows I've got this story written. He says, you've made a commitment not to publish it a year and a half earlier. And so my editor says, well, I think I'm going to honor the commitment because, we are still, the Vietnam War is still going. I go nuts and I write him a long memo saying, it seems to me we did the Pentagon Papers, the famous Pentagon Papers, in 1971, and the Vietnam War was still going, and you didn't worry about the cause then. And they were even much more secret than this. So we had a terrible fight, ended up with me losing. And so I did what I do. I've got a bad temper. I go home and pout. The bureau chief, another Southerner named Clifton Daniel, he married the president's daughter, Margaret Truman. Remember, the President Truman had a daughter. She was a piano player and an opera singer and mystery. She was a very talented kid, and he was a wonderfully charming man. And so he calls my wife up the next night. I hadn't gone to work. I just said, I'm petty. I'm in a pet. He says, tell your husband to grow up and come in and finish the story, and we'll publish it whenever we can. And so I did. I was shamed. And then we published it. So, but it's a fun story because of the exchanges you have with editors.
And one more before we break over here.
Yeah, you're trying to keep this organized, Bill.
I'm trying to.
You're trying, it's like corralling a cat here. Yes, somewhere over there. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Sir. Somebody.
Then we'll go here. Yeah.
Left brain is working here.
I meant this lady here. We'll give you the last question. How's that?
Okay. Yes, sir.
Sorry. I don't know if you watch television. You look like somebody who doesn't. But
I did watch television news. I've given up now that everything is 24-hour, hour-by-hour, constant headlines. It's stupefying.
So there's a documentary series on Showtime about the New York Times.
About the New York. Yeah, I read about it.
It's excellent. But my question is,
can you hear him?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, there's a lot of investigative journalism right now.
Right.
And I'm wondering what you think of it. Well, how are they doing?
The Times, the Times still does a lot of takeouts because even though if you look at the Times, it's sometimes embarrassing. The Saturday paper had no real ads. Advertising's disappeared. I remember when I did this, I was doing a book on Cheney for 5 years. I'd written a lot about Cheney when he was in the White House for the New Yorker. And I got a contract to do a book on Cheney, but when I began to give chapters to people involved, we just couldn't do it because the secrecy was, I didn't want to get, Obama was still president. He was putting people in jail for violating secrets. So my publisher said, I said, you can take any one of my children. And he said, do a memoir, and that's why I did it. But before I could do it, I had to go back and read everything for 6 months because memory's bad, very bad. And the thing about and I happened to look at the 1974 Sunday New York Times was 574 pages. When you look at the papers today, you realize what desperate shape they're in. The Times, when I joined the Times, the profit was limited to 1.5% to 2%. And the rest, if there was too much profit, they would just put it back into sometimes reporter's salary, but usually more the editor's salary. They just put it back into the paper. That was the family-owned newspaper, the Salzburger. It's still owned by the family, but they don't have that kind of profit. They're losing money like crazy, I think. Anyway, they make up for it with online stuff. They do a lot of investigative stories on social stuff, which is very good. I think they're dead wrong about a lot of stuff that's going on now with Congress. They're fighting with Congress. I think you can do a lot more about what happened before the election, what happened in the election, why did Hillary lose. I think there could be much better reporting going on. And this warfare in the FBI is being torn apart between people that were working for Hillary, and we could explain more about what's going on. It's a very serious issue, much more serious. I've been looking at Hillary since she got to Libya in 2011. It's really complicated stuff, and I wouldn't want to see more on the issue today. The automatic fault line is that Trump was elected by the Russians. It's more complicated, much more complicated. And that I don't see. And that was the kind of stuff I would be doing. I mean, the social stuff is great. They're doing, on all this stuff that, the new gender stuff, Me Too. The Times did good stuff on the Me Too stuff and carried that along. But I think there's a lot of other reporting they could do. There's a lot of, and the other problem we have in America right now is most papers are crunched for money. The big chains are taking over, Gannett and others, and sometimes you have a state with only 3 different newspapers. They have 14 different newspapers, but 80% of them are owned by 3 companies, and they publish the same news, and local reporting has fallen way by the wayside. The Post still does it, but the section on local report. You want me to end?
We're going to have to.
The local reporting section is much than it used to be on crime. It's 4 pages some days, no ads, and so that means you don't have as big a local staff. You can't have it. I don't know what they say. You just can't have it. Whatever they tell you, you don't have the reporters. You don't have the money to pay the press. So I see that as, I don't know how it's going to be, and I worry about it because something's going to have to change. We need newspapers, and we need them not to be government run like the BBC is, and we need them. I'll never work for a billionaire. That's my mantra. Not for billionaires, Bezos and others. I don't want to work for a billionaire, and so, but maybe we may all end up being owned by billionaires. All of America. I go to Whole Foods. I want to know if I'm a member of Amazon Prime. I mean, it's really crazy. All right, last question or one more?
It is.
We're done.
It is a great read.
I'll answer any question out there.
Okay. Great read, great evening, and a great career. And Cy Hersh, great reporter. Thank you so much.
Good for you, Bill.